Special Agent Maya Rivers had always been a force to reckon with. Born and raised in Chicago, she grew up watching crime dramas on TV, dreaming of one day standing on the front lines of justice. But her journey wasn't easy. As a black woman in a field dominated by men, and often by white men, she faced challenges that tested her strength, patience, and resolve at every turn. Yet, Maya didn't just survive. She thrived. Her sharp mind, relentless work ethic, and ability to stay calm under pressure earned her respect across the FBI. She was known for solving cases others deemed impossible, and her superiors trusted her implicitly. Now, Maya found herself stepping into unfamiliar territory. The FBI had assigned her to lead a joint task force investigating organized crime in a small southern town called Maple Ridge. It wasn't exactly a glamorous assignment. Maple Ridge was a place where time seemed to stand still, its dusty streets lined with old brick buildings and faded signs. The town had a reputation for being stuck in the past, not just culturally but socially. Racial tensions simmered beneath the surface, and outsiders were rarely welcomed with open arms. Still, Maya saw this as an opportunity to make a real difference. If she could crack this case, it would send a message not only to criminals but also to anyone who doubted her capabilities. When Maya arrived in Maple Ridge, she immediately noticed the stares. Some were curious, others hostile. At 6 feet tall with an authoritative presence, Maya commanded attention wherever she went. She carried herself with confidence, wearing a tailored navy blue suit that screamed professionalism. Her badge hung proudly from her belt, glinting in the sunlight as she stepped out of her car. But despite her polished appearance, she knew looks could be deceiving. Beneath the surface, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just another case, it was a test. Her first stop was the local police station, a squat, red brick building that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and stale paper. Officers milled about, chatting casually or typing away at outdated computers. When Maya introduced herself, the room fell silent. A few nodded politely, but most simply stared, their expressions unreadable. It was clear she was an outsider here, someone who didn't belong. And then there was Sheriff Hank Grady. Grady was everything Maya expected, and worse. Tall and broad-shouldered, he exuded an air of arrogance that filled the room. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and his uniform looked freshly pressed, as though he'd spent hours preparing for this moment. He greeted Maya with a handshake so firm it bordered on aggressive. "So, you're the big-shot agent from the city," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We weren't expecting someone so young." Maya smiled politely, refusing to take the bait. "I'm here to do my job, Sheriff," she replied coolly. "I hope we can work together effectively." Grady smirked, leaning back against his desk as though he owned the place. "Well, we'll see how that goes. Folks around here don't take kindly to strangers telling them what to do, especially when those strangers think they know better than the people who've lived here all their lives." The room tensed, the other officers exchanging nervous glances. Maya kept her expression neutral, but inside, she braced herself. This was going to be harder than she thought. From the very beginning, it was clear that Sheriff Hank Grady had no intention of making things easy for Maya. Their first encounter set the tone for what was to come, a constant battle of wills, with Grady determined to assert his dominance, and Maya steadfast in maintaining her professionalism. Over the next few days, as they began coordinating efforts on the investigation, Grady's behavior only grew more dismissive and condescending. He questioned her every decision, often interrupting her mid-sentence during meetings or rolling his eyes when she spoke. His favorite tactic was to address the room directly, bypassing her entirely, as if she weren't even there. One particularly tense morning, Maya called a briefing to discuss the latest developments in the case. She stood at the front of the room, pointing out key details on a map pinned to the wall. Her voice was calm but firm as she outlined their next steps. Just as she was about to assign tasks to the team, Grady interrupted her with a loud clearing of his throat. "Hold up," he said, leaning forward in his chair with an exaggerated smirk. "Are we sure this plan makes sense? Seems kinda complicated for some folks around here." He glanced around the room, chuckling softly, as though implying that no one except him could possibly understand what Maya was saying. The comet hung in the air like a storm cloud. Maya paused, her fingers gripping the edge of the map slightly tighter than before. She turned to face Grady, her expression unreadable. "Sheriff," she said evenly, "if you have concerns about the strategy, I'd be happy to address them. But interrupting isn't productive." Grady raised his hands defensively, feigning innocence. "No offense meant, Agent Rivers," he drawled, dragging out her last name as if it were a joke. "Just trying to make sure everyone's on the same page. You city folks tend to forget how things work down here." The other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to laugh along with Grady or stay silent. Maya kept her composure, refusing to let him rattle her. But Grady wasn't done. Later that afternoon, while reviewing evidence in the station's cramped conference room, he made another snide remark. This time, it was personal. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair with a lazy grin, "I've seen agents half your age run circles around seasoned pros. Maybe you should stick to paperwork instead of trying to play detective." His words landed like a punch, sharp and deliberate. For a brief moment, Maya felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to provoke her, to see her crack under pressure. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, Maya looked him straight in the eye and replied, "With all due respect, Sheriff, my track record speaks for itself. If you'd prefer to focus on paperwork, I can certainly arrange that, for both of us." Her tone was icy yet controlled, leaving no room for argument. Grady blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then he laughed, brushing off her response as though it were meaningless banter. But Maya noticed something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty. She had struck a nerve. As the days went on, Grady's antics became almost predictable. He would show up late to meetings, muttering under his breath about city slickers wasting his time. He openly mocked Maya's suggestions in front of his deputies, calling her ideas overcomplicated or unnecessary. At one point, he even suggested that she might not be cut out for fieldwork, insinuating that women, and especially black women, didn't belong in leadership roles. Each insult stung, but Maya refused to let it show. Instead, she channeled her frustration into her work, pouring every ounce of energy into solving the case. Despite Grady's hostility, Maya found small victories along the way. Some of the younger officers began warming up to her, impressed by her knowledge and dedication. They started seeking her advice during investigations, quietly acknowledging her expertise. Even Officer Jake Miller, who initially seemed wary of her, began asking thoughtful questions during briefings. These moments gave Maya hope. No matter how much Grady tried to undermine her, she knew she was making progress, not just in the case, but in proving herself to those willing to listen. Still, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that Grady's behavior was more than just petty resistance. There was something deeper at play, something darker lurking beneath the surface. And as tensions continued to rise, she realized that confronting Grady head-on might be the only way to uncover the truth, not just about him, but about the town itself. The tension between Maya and Sheriff Grady reached a boiling point during a critical stakeout operation. The task force had been tracking the key suspect in the organized crime ring, a man known for his violent tendencies and slippery nature. Maya had spent hours meticulously planning the operation, ensuring every detail was accounted for. She knew this could be their best chance to gather solid evidence and finally make progress in the case. But as fate would have it, things didn't go according to plan. And Grady's actions turned what should have been a routine mission into chaos. It all started when Grady arrived late to the stakeout site. Maya had specifically instructed everyone to be in position by 8:00 p.m. sharp, but Grady strolled in nearly half an hour after that, casually sipping from a styrofoam coffee cup like he didn't have a care in the world. When Maya confronted him about his tardiness, he shrugged it off with a smirk. "Relax, Agent Rivers," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "We're not running on your city schedule out here." Maya clenched her jaw, but forced herself to stay focused. They couldn't afford any mistakes, not with so much at stake. As the night wore on, the team monitored the suspect's movements closely. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until Grady decided to take matters into his own hands. Ignoring direct orders from Maya to hold position, he suddenly stepped out of hiding and approached the suspect's vehicle, flashlight in hand. The move was reckless and unnecessary, potentially blowing their cover. "What are you doing?" Maya hissed into her radio, trying to keep her voice low. "Get back to your post." Grady ignored her, waving his flashlight around like he owned the place. Predictably, the suspect noticed the commotion and bolted, speeding away in his car before anyone could react. The entire operation unraveled in seconds. Officers scrambled to give chase, but the damage was done. Their window of opportunity had closed. Back at the station later that night, tempers flared. Maya called an emergency meeting to debrief the team, her frustration simmering just below the surface. As she stood at the front of the room, detailing how Grady's disobedience had jeopardized everything, he interrupted her yet again. This time, though, he wasn't subtle. "Oh, come on," Grady scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Don't act like this is some big failure on my part. If you planned better or given clearer instructions, maybe we wouldn't have lost him." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Maya, waiting to see how she'd respond. For a moment, she simply stared at Grady, her dark eyes burning with quiet intensity. Then, without raising her voice, she began dismantling his argument piece by piece. "Sheriff Grady," she said, her tone measured but firm, "let's review exactly what happened tonight. You were late arriving at the scene despite being given specific instructions. You disobeyed a direct order to remain hidden, compromising our position. And now, because of your actions, a dangerous suspect is still on the loose. Does that sound like planning issues to you?" Grady opened his mouth to retort, but Maya cut him off. She listed every misstep he'd made, pointing out how each one had escalated the situation. Her words were precise, backed by facts and logic that left no room for denial. By the time she finished, even Grady looked uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The other officers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others avoided eye contact altogether. But Grady wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead of apologizing, he doubled down, turning the blame back on Maya. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he snapped, his face reddening. "Coming in here with your fancy degrees and big city attitude, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, let me tell you something. No one cares about your credentials in Maple Ridge. You're nothing but a quota hire who got lucky." The insult hit hard, cutting through the professional armor Maya had worked so hard to maintain. For a split second, she felt the sting of his words, the weight of every racist stereotype, and doubt she'd faced throughout her career crashing down on her. But instead of crumbling, something inside her shifted. She straightened her posture, leveling Grady with a piercing gaze. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady but laced with steel. "I'm not from Maple Ridge. I'm here because I earned the right to be. And if you can't respect that, or follow basic protocol, then maybe it's time we reconsider who really belongs in this room." Her unexpected response sent shockwaves through the room. No one spoke, no one moved. Even Grady seemed taken aback, his usual bravado faltering under the weight of her conviction. It was clear to everyone present that Maya wasn't just fighting for justice in this case. She was fighting for something much bigger. Later that evening, Maya retreated to her hotel room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting out a long, shaky breath. The confrontation with Grady replayed in her mind like a broken record, each insult and accusation echoing louder than the last. For all her strength and resilience, moments like this reminded her of just how exhausting it was to constantly fight battles that shouldn't exist in the first place. She walked over to the small desk by the window and sank into the chair, staring blankly at the stack of case files scattered across its surface. Outside, the streets of Maple Ridge were quiet, the town settling into its usual rhythm as night fell. But inside, Maya's thoughts raced. She replayed every word she'd said to Grady, wondering if she could have handled things differently. Had she been too soft, too harsh? Would the other officers see her as weak because of the way Grady had treated her? Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her spiral of doubt. It was a text from Marcus Hayes, her mentor, and one of the few people who truly understood what she was up against. "How's it going?" The message read. Simple, yet loaded with meaning. Maya hesitated before responding. She didn't want to appear vulnerable, even to someone as supportive as Marcus. But after a few seconds, she typed back, "It's challenging." Within minutes, her phone rang. Marcus's deep, steady voice greeted her on the other end. "Tell me what's going on," he said without preamble. There was no judgment in his tone, only warmth and understanding. Slowly, Maya began to open up, recounting the events of the day. The botched stakeout, Grady's blatant insubordination, and the humiliating comments he'd hurled at her in front of the team. As she spoke, the frustration and hurt she'd been holding back bubbled to the surface. Marcus listened patiently, offering occasional murmurs of encouragement. When she finished, there was a brief pause before he spoke. "Maya," he said gently, "you know why you're there, don't you?" She frowned, unsure where he was heading. "To lead the investigation." "Yes, but it's more than that," Marcus replied. "You're there to prove something, not just to them, but to yourself. Every challenge you face is an opportunity to show exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Don't let someone like Grady take that away from you." His words struck a chord deep within her. Maya had always known that being a black woman in law enforcement meant carrying a heavier burden than most. She had to work twice as hard to earn half the recognition, constantly proving herself in spaces where she wasn't welcome. But hearing Marcus frame her struggles as opportunities shifted something inside her. This wasn't just about surviving Grady's hostility. It was about thriving despite it. "Grady wants to break you," Marcus continued. "He wants you to lash out, to give him ammunition to use against you. But Maya, you're smarter than that. You've got grace, patience, and intelligence on your side. Use those tools. Let him trip himself up while you stay focused on the bigger picture." The advice resonated with Maya. She realized that reacting impulsively or stooping to Grady's level would only play into his hands. If she wanted to win, not just the argument, but the respect of the team and the success of the case, she needed to rise above it. Her response to Grady earlier in the meeting had been instinctive, born of frustration, but now she saw an opportunity to turn the situation to her advantage. As they wrapped up their call, Marcus left her with one final thought. "Remember why you started this journey, Maya. You didn't come this far to let anyone dim your light." After hanging up, Maya sat quietly for a while, letting Marcus's words sink in. She glanced at the case files on the desk, her resolve slowly hardening. Grady might think he could intimidate her, but he underestimated her determination and her ability to adapt. She picked up a pen and began jotting down notes, outlining strategies to regain control of the investigation and expose Grady's true colors. By the time she turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, exhaustion still lingered, but so did a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would be different. The next morning, Maya arrived at the police station with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted in her overnight, a clarity of purpose, a resolve to take control of the situation without letting Grady's antics derail her mission. She knew the stakes were high, not just for the case, but for her reputation and the respect she needed to command if they were going to succeed. As she walked into the briefing room, she could feel the tension in the air. The officers exchanged wary glances, unsure what to expect after the previous night's blow-up. Grady was already seated at the head of the table, his usual smug expression firmly in place. When he saw Maya enter, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if daring her to try anything. But Maya didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she calmly set down her files, adjusted her jacket, and began addressing the team as though nothing unusual had happened. "Let's review where we stand," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. She outlined the current status of the investigation, highlighting key evidence they'd gathered so far. Her delivery was professional, concise, and impossible to interrupt. She left no gaps for Grady to wedge himself into. For once, he stayed silent, though his scowl deepened with each passing minute. When she finished summarizing the case, Maya turned her attention directly to Grady. "Sheriff," she said, locking eyes with him, "I want to address what happened last night during the stakeout. Your actions compromised our operation and put everyone at risk. We can't afford mistakes like that moving forward." Grady stiffened, clearly unprepared for her directness. "You're still hung up on that?" He shot back, trying to sound dismissive. "We all make calls in the heat of the moment. Maybe you should focus less on pointing fingers and more on catching these guys." Maya didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed almost amused by his attempt to deflect blame. "Actually, Sheriff," she replied coolly, "your call wasn't made in the heat of the moment. It was reckless and deliberate. You ignored clear instructions, left your post prematurely, and jeopardized the entire operation. That's not leadership, it's negligence." Her words hit like a punch, silencing the room. Even Grady looked momentarily stunned, his usual bravado faltering under her unwavering gaze. Sensing an opening, Maya pressed on. She pulled out a detailed timeline of the stakeout, complete with timestamps and radio transcripts, laying bare every decision Grady had made, and how each one had contributed to their failure. "You arrived late despite being given explicit instructions," she continued, ticking off points on her fingers. "You disobeyed orders to maintain surveillance, and when confronted, instead of owning up to your mistakes, you tried to shift the blame onto me. Does that sound like accountability to anyone here?" The other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some nodded subtly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Grady's face flushed red, but he couldn't muster a coherent rebuttal. Every attempt he made to defend himself only dug him deeper into a hole Maya had expertly prepared. But Maya wasn't done yet. She leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. "And then there's this." She held up a document she'd received earlier that morning, a confidential report detailing suspicious financial transactions linked to Grady's personal accounts. It was circumstantial, yes, but damning enough to raise serious questions. "It seems you've been receiving payments from sources outside your official duties. Care to explain why someone tied to the criminal organization we're investigating has been depositing money into your account?" The room went completely still. Grady's mouth dropped open, his cocky demeanor evaporating in an instant. "That's a lie," he sputtered, slamming his fist on the table. "You're making accusations based on nothing." Maya raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his outburst. "These aren't my accusations, Sheriff. This is evidence collected through proper channels. If you're innocent, I'm sure internal affairs will clear things up quickly. But until then, I suggest you step aside and let professionals handle this case." Grady stared at her, his face pale with shock and rage. For the first time, he had no comeback, no clever remark to deflect attention. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the gravity of what they were witnessing. Maya had just exposed not only Grady's incompetence, but also his potential corruption, all without raising her voice or losing her composure. As the meeting adjourned, Maya felt a surge of satisfaction. She hadn't just defended herself against Grady's attacks. She'd dismantled his authority entirely, and in doing so, she had earned something far more valuable than respect: trust. The fallout from Maya's confrontation with Grady rippled through the police station like a storm. Officers who had once kept their distance now approached her cautiously, their body language betraying a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. It was clear that Grady's reputation, once untouchable in Maple Ridge, had been shaken to its core. For years, he had ruled the department with an iron fist, using intimidation and favoritism to maintain control. But Maya had exposed cracks in his armor, revealing him not as the fearless leader he pretended to be, but as a flawed man clinging desperately to power. Later that afternoon, Officer Jake Miller knocked on the open door of the makeshift office Maya had claimed for herself, a small, cluttered room at the back of the station. He looked hesitant, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Agent Rivers," he began, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was listening. "Do you have a minute?" Maya looked up from the stack of files she'd been reviewing and gestured for him to come in. "Of course, Officer Miller. What's on your mind?" Jake closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. After a moment of silence, he spoke. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For how things have been around here, you didn't deserve any of that." Maya studied him carefully. Jake was younger than most of the deputies, with an earnestness about him that suggested he hadn't fully bought into Grady's toxic culture. Still, his apology caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said finally, her tone softening. "That means a lot." He nodded, then hesitated again before continuing. "Look, I'll admit, I wasn't sure about you when you first got here. Not because of, well, not entirely because of what Grady said, but," his voice trailed off, and he sighed. "It's hard to explain. Around here, people don't take change well, especially when it comes from someone outside the town." "I understand," Maya replied, leaning back in her chair. "Change can feel threatening, especially if you're used to doing things a certain way." "Yeah," Jake agreed, rubbing the back of his neck. "But after seeing how you handled everything with Grady with the investigation, it made me realize something. You're not here to prove a point or stir things up for the sake of it. You're here to do your job. And honestly, that scares Grady more than anything." Maya raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Why do you think that is?" Jake shrugged. "Because if you succeed, it shows everyone else that we don't need guys like him running things. That maybe we've been letting the wrong people call the shots for too long." His words struck a chord with Maya. She had always known that Grady's hostility stemmed from insecurity, but hearing it articulated by someone else gave her a fresh perspective. Perhaps Grady wasn't just lashing out because of prejudice. Perhaps he was afraid of being replaced, or worse, exposed. Taking a deep breath, Jake leaned forward slightly. "Anyway, I wanted to let you know that if you need anything, if there's information or support you're looking for, I'm willing to help. Off the record, if that's what it takes." Maya felt a flicker of hope. Having an ally within the ranks could make all the difference in navigating the murky waters of Maple Ridge. "I appreciate that, Jake," she said sincerely. "And I'll take you up on it. But I need to be clear, this isn't about taking sides. It's about finding the truth and holding people accountable, no matter who they are." "I get that," Jake replied firmly. "And I think a lot of us do too. We're just scared, I guess. Scared of what happens if we stand up to someone like Grady." Maya nodded, understanding the fear all too well. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she said softly. "It's acting in spite of it. If you're ready to step forward, even in small ways, it'll make a difference. Trust me." Over the next few days, Jake proved true to his word. He began feeding Maya subtle but valuable pieces of information. Details about Grady's past dealings, whispers among the deputies about suspicious activities, and insights into the inner workings of the criminal organization they were investigating. With each new tidbit, Maya pieced together a clearer picture of the corruption festering beneath Maple Ridge's surface. Their partnership quickly became instrumental in advancing the case. While Maya worked tirelessly to connect the dots, Jake helped bridge the gap between her and the rest of the team. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere at the station began to shift. Officers who had once doubted Maya started seeking her input, recognizing her competence and fairness. Even those still loyal to Grady couldn't deny the growing evidence against him. As the investigation gained momentum, Maya realized that Jake's support wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Together, they represented something bigger than themselves. With Jake's help, Maya began digging deeper into Grady's connections with the criminal organization they were investigating. The financial records she'd uncovered earlier were just the tip of the iceberg. Jake revealed that Grady had been unusually lenient in certain cases over the years, cases involving key players in the crime ring. There were whispers about bribes exchanged under the table, suspiciously light sentences for dangerous criminals, and even rumors of Grady attending secretive meetings late at night. Armed with this new information, Maya worked tirelessly to gather concrete evidence. She reviewed old case files, cross-referenced arrest records, and analyzed patterns of behavior within the department. Every piece of data brought her closer to exposing Grady's web of corruption. But time was running out. The criminal organization wasn't sitting idle. They were growing bolder, their activities escalating rapidly. If Maya didn't act soon, innocent lives could be at risk. One evening, Maya called a private meeting with Jake and a few trusted officers who had begun to support her cause. They gathered in an abandoned storage room at the station, its flickering fluorescent light casting long shadows on the walls. "We're close," Maya said, spreading out documents on a dusty table. "But we need proof that ties Grady directly to these crimes. Something undeniable." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "There's a guy, Tommy Marks. He used to work closely with Grady before retiring last year. Word is, he knows more than he lets on. If anyone can confirm what's going on, it's him." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Do you think he'll talk?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but I can reach out to him, see if he's willing to meet." The next day, Jake arranged a covert meeting with Tommy Marks at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Maya watched from a distance as the two men spoke, her heart pounding with anticipation. After nearly an hour, Jake returned, his face pale but determined. "He's scared," Jake said quietly, "but he agreed to cooperate. On one condition, he wants protection." Maya didn't hesitate. "Done. Set it up." Tommy provided them with damning evidence, audio recordings of conversations between Grady and members of the crime syndicate, bank statements showing large sums deposited into offshore accounts, and even handwritten notes detailing bribe agreements. With this trove of information, Maya finally had everything she needed to bring Grady down. The confrontation came during a tense morning briefing. Maya stood at the front of the room, flanked by federal agents who had arrived to assist with the arrest. As she laid out the evidence against Grady, the room fell silent. Officers exchanged stunned looks, while Grady sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You're making a mistake," he growled, standing abruptly. "This is all lies." "No, Sheriff," Maya replied calmly, stepping forward. "These are facts. And today, justice will be served." Grady lunged toward her, shouting accusations, but the federal agents quickly subdued him. Handcuffs clicked into place as he was led away, his protests echoing down the hallway. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, applause broke out among the officers. Some cheered, others simply nodded in approval, but all shared a collective sigh of relief. In the days that followed, the town of Maple Ridge buzzed with the news of Grady's arrest. Residents who had lived in fear of the corrupt sheriff and his ties to organized crime felt a renewed sense of safety. Meanwhile, the task force dismantled the criminal organization, arresting its leaders and seizing illegal assets worth millions. It was a victory not just for the FBI, but for the entire community. As Maya packed her belongings to leave Maple Ridge, she couldn't help but feel proud, not just of solving the case, but of proving that integrity and perseverance could overcome even the deepest roots of corruption. As Maya prepared to leave Maple Ridge, the town felt different, not because its dusty streets or faded buildings had changed, but because the people in it had. The once hostile officers who had doubted her now lined up outside the police station to shake her hand and thank her. Some even offered heartfelt apologies for their initial skepticism. It wasn't just about solving the case anymore. Maya had left an indelible mark on the community, proving that leadership transcended prejudice and fear. Standing beside her car, Maya took a moment to reflect on everything she'd been through. She thought about the countless late nights spent poring over evidence, the tense confrontations with Grady, and the quiet moments of doubt when she wondered if she'd made the right choice to come here. But most of all, she thought about the lessons she'd learned, not just about crime or corruption, but about resilience, courage, and the power of leading by example. Jake approached her one last time before she left, his usual nervous energy replaced by genuine gratitude. "Agent Rivers," he said, extending his hand. "I can't tell you how much this means to me, to all of us. You didn't just solve a case. You showed us what real leadership looks like." Maya shook his hand firmly, a small smile playing on her lips. "It wasn't just me, Jake. You played a big part in this, too. Don't forget that." He nodded, looking down at his boots for a moment before meeting her gaze again. Do you think things will actually change around here? Or will they go back to the way they were?" Maya considered the question carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she admitted. "But every step forward counts. What you've done, what all of you have started, is important. Keep pushing for accountability. Keep standing up for what's right. And eventually, those little steps will add up to something bigger." Her words seemed to reassure him, and he smiled faintly as she turned to load her suitcase into the trunk of her car. As she slid behind the wheel, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the officers still gathered outside the station. They weren't perfect, and neither was the system they worked within. But they were trying. And sometimes, that was enough. The drive out of Maple Ridge gave Maya time to process everything. She thought about Grady, whose arrest had sent shockwaves through the town. His downfall wasn't just a personal victory for her. It was a reminder that no one was above the law, no matter how untouchable they believed themselves to be. She also thought about Jake and the other officers who had begun to see beyond their biases, choosing instead to focus on integrity and justice. By the time she reached the highway, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. This case had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also reinforced why she'd chosen this path in the first place. She wasn't just fighting criminals, she was breaking down barriers, challenging outdated systems, and paving the way for others who might follow in her footsteps. Back at FBI headquarters, Maya's handling of the Maple Ridge investigation became legendary. Her ability to navigate hostility, expose corruption, and inspire trust earned her accolades from colleagues and superiors alike. More importantly, it served as a powerful example for young agents, especially women and minorities, that excellence could overcome prejudice. Her story was shared during training sessions, inspiring future generations to stand firm in the face of adversity. Months later, Maya received a letter from Jake. In it, he wrote about the changes taking place in Maple Ridge. New policies implemented to prevent corruption, increased transparency within the department, and a growing sense of unity among the officers. He ended the letter with a simple sentence: "You changed us, Agent Rivers. Thank you." Reading those words, Maya felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, for herself or for others like her, but she also knew that progress was possible. One person, one decision, one act of courage at a time, the world could become a better place. And as long as there were people willing to fight for justice, hope would never fade.